To understand the significance of eyes within Resident Evil, first we should take a look at what eyes usually symbolize in fiction in general, and more specifically in horror fiction.
Eyes are the windows to the soul. It's a popular phrase that can be traced back to the ancient Rome, to the Roman philosopher Cicero, who more specifically said the face is a picture of the mind as the eyes are its interpreter. Although the quote, "the eyes are the windows to the soul," is most frequently attributed to William Shakespeare, whether or not that Shakespeare get the quote from Cicero does not really matter, neither does really the origin of the quote itself. What matters here today is the meaning of the quote.
It highlights how emotions and inner thoughts are often revealed through a person's gaze. Oftentimes you can actually see techniques and measures taken in works of art, whether it's camera framing in a way that it focuses on a character's eyes, or in works like anime and manga, because I know you like those, you fucking weeb, where the faces of characters are specifically designed to put a large emphasis on eyes, while the other facial features are, well, not ignored but visibly less prominent, or perhaps just a description in books. Eyes are the perfect weapon to utilize when you are trying to show and not tell, as oftentimes they can convey unspoken feelings of the characters. Eyes can be burning with anger or sparkling with joy, as it is a lot more powerful to have a character give a burning glare than to just have them say, "I hate you." Of course that can work as well, but depends on the context. Through careful attention to the details of characters' eyes, art can breathe life into emotion, making each scene more immersive and compelling. This is of course more literal use of eyes in art, although the beautiful balls of sight can often be used in a more symbolic sense.
Look no further than at George Orwell's 1984, the book a couple of years ago everyone liked to quote without actually reading. Cover of this book usually depicts a giant eye,
in this case symbolizing the authoritarian government, eye being the organ of sight. This cover gives off the idea of oppression and surveillance.
This certainly could have some meaning in the context of Resident Evil, as many times, especially in the older titles, you do feel watched, in the way that you have the idea that anything could happen to you at any given moment. I mean, even the framing of the older games, where you had this fixed view in the corner of a room, almost looked like you're watching your character through a surveillance camera. And not only that, similarly to 1984, original Resident Evil 2 also featured an eye on its cover. However, more than surveillance, I'd argue the symbolism of eyes within Resident Evil has more to do with the uncanny valley. Because eyes serve
for us to recognize emotions, the mutilation of eyes can have severe consequences. Seeing such an eye can simply make us uneasy. So in this context, such a strong emphasis on eyes further solidifies the idea of mutation and losing one's humanity. And interestingly, Resident Evil can do this multiple ways. I'll show you two scenes, one from Resident Evil and the other from Resident Evil Remake, which is the same scene, but in my opinion uses the idea in two different ways. Did you spot the difference? It's the iris. While the zombie in the original game has a very prominent and visible iris, which when he turns and looks at you, makes you feel like you're his primary target now. Feels like he almost knows what he's doing. There's no fear, just the pure and unfiltered determination to kill you.
The prominent presence of the iris feels like he's a thinking being. On the other hand, the remake, the iris is not that prominent. If you look closely, it is there, but if you're not realizing that you're looking for it, his eye looks like a glass, like it's empty. The movement of his iris is also more chaotic. It's not calculated, it almost doesn't feel like he's looking at you. Actually, in a lot of ways, he reminds me of the zombie zombies from The Walking Dead.
My point is, the zombies in The Walking Dead are truly brain dead. Just like you, they do not have goals, they do not think or anything. And of course the zombie in the original Resident Evil 1 also does not really have any goal. It's not like he actually thinks, he's virtually the same as the zombie in the remake. My point is, he looks like he's thinking. And because that was the first game in the franchise, you didn't really know what to think. I mean, even in the very first cutscene of the game, it's a zombie dog chasing the characters. So the first zombie in the game could have really been anything in your mind when you first played it.
Of course, by the time the remake rolled around, we all already knew what the game is about, so there was no real reason to make the zombies look like they're thinking. And then, of course, Resident Evil 2 came along, with, again, as I mentioned,
an eye being a prominent factor of the cover, but also the main reason why I'm even making this video, and that's William Birkin, more specifically the creation of the G-Virus. One of the most recognizable features of the G-Virus is a giant eye or eyes that whoever or whatever is infected with it grows on their body.
In the remake of Resident Evil 2, the eyes are the weak spots of the monsters, and I'm pretty sure that would have been the case in the original Resident Evil 2, but due to the limitations of the time, that just wasn't doable. The G-monsters are by far not the only monsters in the franchise that have weak spots in their eyes. This trend would later return in Resident Evil 4, namely in the Salazar boss fight, where the Vertigo has a weak eye that you're supposed to shoot before Salazar shows up. And also, of course, in the final battle against Sadler. Same also with Jack Baker in one of his boss fights in Resident Evil 7. I think it was the final boss fight against him in the main campaign before he would return in the DLC with Joe Baker.
This has probably happened a lot more. These are the most prominent examples that come to mind. Why eyes of all things and not heart, for example. Actually, heart is also a thing that happens in Resident Evil a lot. That is a topic for another day. I think when it comes to eyes as the weak spot, it all basically boils down to this.
Basically, as the eyes are the windows to the soul, sort of the more distorted and inhumane they get. I think this is meant to symbolize the loss of their humanity, as when we do look into those distorted eyes, we don't really see the soul. There is really nothing left from the people that they were before. This is especially true for Jack Baker, as he especially used to be a kind person before meeting and adopting Evelyn.
Think about it this way. It is normal for humans to have two eyes. The transferred enemies in Resident Evil usually progressively grow more eyes with each mutation, which not only gives us more targets that we need to focus on and destroy in order to defeat the enemy, effectively making the enemy stronger and more resilient. It also strays them away further from humanity. This is most evident with William Birkin, who shows up at first with just one giant eye on his shoulder, but with each mutation he grows more and more all across his body. It's also the case for Sadler, as he at first only shows one giant eye inside his mouth when he's fighting Ada, but of course grows a lot more of them when he fights Leon. I think we can trace this all back to the first zombie in Resident Evil franchise that I already talked about, with as much focus being put on his first introduction, and especially the gaze that he gives either Chris or Jill, depends on who you're playing as. The game was, in my opinion, trying to tell you in what spirit the franchise is gonna continue. Basically, the game told you right away that the eyes are going to be an important indicator
of what to look for when someone is becoming a monster. Whether it's the classic Resident Evil 1 zombies' eyes that are locked on you, or the blank eyes of the zombie in Resident Evil 1 remake, completely devoid of any humanity or emotion or goal.
Or in this case, the G-monsters whose eyes are very chaotic and wide open even though they're not necessarily watching you. The eye is also a rather delicate organ. When it comes to body horror, the mutilation of eyes is one of the worst things you can think of. They are an irreplaceable organ and provide probably the most useful sense of all, which is sight. So naturally the mutilation of eyes will be deeply disturbing to us. Lastly, I would just say monstrous eyes are featured on the covers of both Resident Evil Revelations and Revelations 2. In those cases, however, I'd argue it has more to do with the observation aspects of eye symbolism, as the first Revelations game is very much a political thriller, as all the steps that the protagonists are taking are watched by Morgan Lansdale, who turns out to be a part of a giant bioterrorist conspiracy by the end of the game. With Revelations 2 it is a bit more obvious, as Alex Wesker is literally called the Observer. And by the way, Resident Evil Revelations 2 is also the most underrated game in the franchise. You should really play it if you haven't. I think this is the general idea behind the symbolism of eyes within Resident Evil. If you like and subscribe right now, I promise you I will invent the G virus, which will allow people to grow large eyes on their bodies, which will generally improve the eyesight of a large population of the world. So thank you for watching with your eyes, and hopefully I will see you next time.